I am pleased to be joined today by Minister of the Environment for Ontario, the Honourable Glen Murray, and also Member of Provincial Parliament for Toronto Centre. Welcome, Glen.
Hey.
So thank you so much for making time to be with us today, both on Regent Park Radio, and we're filming this also for Regent Park Television. I think we want to cover a lot of things today, and we appreciate your time, but let's start last night here in Regent Park. There was about 1,000 people showed up at the Daniel Spectrum for the first kind of public forum around the Antiracism Directorate with Minister Couteau. And tell us a little bit about what that's about and what the Wynne government, your government, hopes to accomplish.
Well, it's interesting because it's, for the Premier, this is very personally. Mm-hmm. She was there, and she's been really out in a leadership role on this. We're a very complex, multicultural, multiracial society, and we differentiate ourselves from the United States. And the American agenda, I think, has brought into very sharp focus with the shootings of police officers in Dallas and the shooting of Philando Castile and others has created a greater awareness and sensitivity about race relations in general and race relations in the police. And there is a recognition, I think, in the aftermath of incidents around carding and new legislation that Minister McVie brought forward, which I think is very progressive and helped move that agenda forward. There's some very, very deep issues that need to get resolved, and no one really has some very good answers right now, and that people haven't been listening. And the Premier and Minister Couteau said it's time to, press the pause button and stop running to solutions and start listening to people. So it was I understand a 4-hour listening exercise
marathon,
of that, and then how that to keep that conversation going, unrelentingly until we get to a point where we have some, if I can use that old French word, rapprochement between groups and some common understanding of the problem, because I think that's been a real issue is people not fully understanding how other people feel, how other people perceive that. There'll be, you and I were chatting earlier about our friend Desmond Cole, who's provided, who's made himself very vulnerable in his vulnerability and telling his story as a young black man growing up in Toronto. Those things that aren't often violent or criminal but are exclusionary, you're not invited into, you're treated distinctly differently in your experience of walking down the street, creates two realities in the city that aren't coming together. And both the Premier and Minister Couteau are really looking to try to bring those realities, bring the reality of black people into the lives of police officers, and bring the lives of policing and security issues more fully in dialogue with the community. I was meeting with one of the senior officials in the police department on some other issues today, who happens to be a young black man, and we got into the side conversation about wearing the uniform and living in his uniform and living in his skin in the city, and the complexity in that. And the difficulty he has, both as a police officer and a black man, and so and we were talking about the lives of gay people and black people who are often, they're often people who wear, well, most of us wear more than one minority status or have different kinds of dimension to ourselves that make us complicated. And so these things are never as clearly delineated as we often think they are.
Yeah, I grew up in a world where I didn't check off any of the minority status boxes, so for me, I know it's a steep learning curve, and I'm trying to shut up and listen most of all, and I think it's a good place to begin. What about what happened at Pride? Where are you on that?
Oh, my God. If anyone ever thinks that community radio doesn't ask the hardest hitting questions, well, there you go, right there. I default in the best and the worst sense of the word to my own personal experience growing up as a gay person. Right? And my first experiences with police officers were in Montreal, where most of the gay bars I went to were on the second floor. and they were on the second floor of buildings, so you could hear the police storming up. And I remember vividly when I was, 19, 20, 21, the older gay men, the big bears as we called them, getting by the door and preventing the police officers from coming in, because at that time we had no human rights and no legal protections, and you would be charged for being found in a body house, which basically means by going out and having a beer with your mates in a gay bar, you were going to be charged as being found in a house of prostitution. And I had lots of escapes, fire escapes, and back across the roofs in downtown Montreal. My parents never knew about this life I was leading, and that was the first thing they did. So I grew up with a fear of police, and flash forward to the early 80s, living in Toronto, I and Peter Caldwell and a bunch of our friends, Kent Darling, started something called the Toronto Gay Patrol with a bunch of the guys in the community. And Thursday, if I remember correctly, Friday and Saturday, from about 9 to 2 or 3 in the morning, we would wear bright white painter's pants at the time. And the first time Lacoste shirts were
pants, yes.
bright pink Lacoste shirts, and we had big whistles like duck whistles, and we had flashlights, and we would literally patrol the neighborhood, the village, and the back alleys, because the bashers would come down. They'd often wait in the alleys, and they'd beat the crap out of you. And the police thought this was a spectator sport. They would sit in their patrol cars and they would look up. And I remember one of the guys I was dating at the time literally was used like a battering ram into a brick wall and had a terrible concussion, barely recovered from it. And we were often rushing with people to hospital. And then I came back. Then I went to Winnipeg, and my own journey is being out and the transformation. I used to say when I was a mayor, I became an honorary heterosexual because I got invited into clubs that often gay people were never allowed, and certainly openly. And that was an amazing revolution in how people treated me. I was the first out gay guy to be a mayor of a major city in the world, and that I never understood what white male privilege was as fully as until I became a mayor, because I got included in that club again. And then the journey coming back to Toronto, which is sort of comes to the point of the parade, where I came back and I thought, gay officers, gay outreach, gay recruitment, police in pride, and the dialogue. And as I got elected here as an MPP, working with Bill Blair, and what I thought for the gay community was an incredibly positive engagement. It was so much of a change. And then realizing that for the black community, they were experiencing, I can't say the same kind of thing, but certainly a discrimination that I and my friend, I would hear from young gay men in the early 80s in Toronto about how they thought the police, which was, these are the guys who often beat you up and will be a witness to the violence against you, not letting it. And that, anytime you went to a bar, they were more, or a bathhouse or wherever people, were chose to hang out, that the police were more often the problem than a source of security, and that deep visceral fear that I always grew up with. I ran away from police officers. I always thought they would cause me problems and harm. And I was hearing that same kind of language. Not saying the gay experience, I want to be very clear, is like or can be imported into the black community. That's a different history, a different experience. But certainly the tension with police was extremely visceral. I have hope that maybe there's something in that journey that we had as a gay community, though a different journey. It took 3 years to arrive at a place of reconciliation with the police largely, which I think is there. But I think we have to ensure that it doesn't take 30 years, but we get to a place where the relationship between the black community, policing and justice, and the prison system, which is the other part of the problem, and they're all related, and the education system actually respects black people and includes them. I started on a working group for marginalized students at the Toronto District School Board many years ago when I first came back to Toronto. And I remember people saying, here there are challenges in certain cultural and ethnocultural communities where the Toronto District School Board had a pretty good idea of which kids, with a pretty high probability, wouldn't make it through high school. And this was the early days when the Pathways to Education was starting all these community initiatives to try and support young people and kids in racialized and marginalized communities. I think there's a gap we have to fill as well between the education system trying to struggle with supporting kids, who the complexity and issues in their life that marginalize them are happening as often outside the school system as inside the school system, and then when this gets reduced to a policing issue at the other end. I think that this isn't just a crisis in policing or a crisis in community, that we have to fundamentally look at the entire experience that young black men and women have growing up in our city, and start asking us some fundamental questions about, why kids in heavily policed neighborhoods first experience with the cops at 12, 13, 14 is to be charged with something. Maybe we have to start at a very young age with a very different conversation between young people particularly and police officers. And I think there's a willingness, I hearing in my own community on both sides. The police want to change that relationship, and the community wants to change that relationship. So I'm hopeful. But I realize I don't have the answers. I don't live in that skin. I don't walk in that life. My journey, the discrimination that I faced, teaches me some things, but I feel woefully inadequate. And that's why I support the Premier and the community and Black Lives Matter and the police service in trying to construct, those people who are trying to construct conversations are brave people, and we should support them.
When I first moved into this community, and I've been down here now, I guess, almost 11 years, my oldest son, was doing a Friday night drop-in for some youth in St. Jamestown, and they were out at about 9 o'clock at night playing Capture the Flag and making some noise. One of the people in the buildings called the cops. My son, who never grew up afraid of the cops, said that the police officer drove up on the lawn with his lights blaring and on his speaker, and he said the kids scattered, just like when you lift a rock and all the bugs run in all different directions. They were terrified. They were 12, 13, 14 years old, just as you say, and he went up to them and said, "We're part of a church group. We're doing a Friday night drop-in. We're just playing Capture the Flag with these kids." And the police officer said, "Well, that's great. Keep doing that," and drove away. But such a difference between his experience and their experience. Their first reaction was, "The police are here. We're in trouble. We have to run." So I think that just
It's interesting to say, because one of the one of the senior officials that I've met with recently. We were talking about the value of community police resource officers, and that, and those experiences generally I think are quite good and are working well with the police. But what I hear from community leaders, if I go when I'm in one of the mosques, I'm talking with some of the older gentlemen in the Somali community who are often it's their grandchildren who they're talking about. I did not grow up in a heavily policed neighborhood.
Yeah.
And so I rarely saw police officers. Mm-hmm. But when I hear some of the things that kids are being charged with or taken in with, or, someone stopping them and taking down their information, I hate to admit it, they were the same kinds of things I did when I was 12, 13, 14, and 15. And yes, were they in conflict with the law? Yeah, I have to admit. But in my peer group and the high school I went to, on the way home from school, we did some things our parents wouldn't have wanted us to do, and they weren't violent. We weren't hitting or hurting people, but they were things that were the mischief and pranks and stuff that we get into, and I won't get into details to that, but I mean, you can imagine what those things are. And these kids are doing things, and they're in a heavily policed neighborhood. So the chance that that there's a police cruiser or a police officer watching them are about 100 times more than that. And I'm not sure I could have passed the scrutiny if I lived in some of the neighborhoods that have that heavy level of policing, which the community wants, because these are areas where people and women and many folks are more at risk and want that higher level of safety. So we talked about how does that relationship change? Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like it's not the resource officer. The complaints I get is the police officer who comes up and grabs a young person by their shirt and pushes them against the wall. Mm-hmm. What you said, that comes in with the megaphone, that feels the need to, treat them in a harsh way, take information, physically be quite aggressive, and putting them in the back of a cruiser car for 10 minutes and leaving the kid there scared as to whether he's going to be taken in or charged with something. I just think that kind of tone, and it's interesting because some of the superintendents have been moving police officers into that enforcement patrol car that are as sensitive as the resource officers are. And I think it's that enforcement relationship at the neighborhood level that is. And I think to sort of suggest that, well, the resource officers are doing a great job, and I think the police service is trying here, that we don't, and the superintendents I've been talking to in the area are becoming more sensitive to that. They're raising these issues with me and saying, we've got to make sure that the style of enforcement is not the kind of experience that your son experience, which is too often the experience sometimes in heavily policed neighborhoods.
The norm. You mentioned education in there, and what's the old saying? If you think education is expensive, you should see the price of ignorance, right? Yeah. So I know the government is doing some pretty progressive things around helping students, particularly in at-risk communities, get an undergraduate degree. Tell us a little bit about what's going on there.
Well, maybe just put it in context first, because it's been a bit of a journey for a decade, and sometimes when we've been very fortunate to be governing Ontario for 12 years now, I think, just about. I for about half of that as an MPP here after George Smitherman retired. And there was a long journey that was laid out by former Premier McGuinty and now Premier Wynne, the former Education Minister, both of them passionate with that. And it started here in Regent Park in some ways. I mean, Kathleen Wynne was a school trustee and was very aware of what came out of Regent Park. Diane Spence in the community here, and many others, and the folks who got involved in Pathways to Education, and that program and that funding, which has come generously from government and generally from other sources, and the mentoring and the financial support for students through the public school system, particularly high school, was really transformative, and that was one of the first building blocks. And then Regent Park has really been in the center of that Parents for a Better Beginning. How do you help kids get a better start? How do you get the family around children to help the parents in that? And that's a hugely successful program. Right down to the birthing center. One of the only 2 birthing centers was launched here in Regent Park. And then early childhood education, K4, K5. So you've now got more parental support and now wraparound childcare. So you were working all the way through the school system from birth, literally, all the way to the end of high school. But the question was, the big block was, and this was true in conversations I've had with my constituents, was, university and college is just too expensive. And I would sometimes ask them, well, do you know what it would cost to go to George Brown for a year? Do you know about the assistance programs or the grants or the 30% off tuition? And that meant nothing to people. It was like a place that was a culturally trespassed for some folks. It was just like a place we don't go. And so you have U of T, and you have Ryerson, and you have George Brown. You have 3 incredible post-secondary institutions within walking distance of where we are right now in Regent Park. And they might have been on Mars for a lot of folks, because it was just not in the consciousness of families struggling with retirement, struggling with all the other costs of life. So if you're under $53,000 now, let's make sure I get my numbers, I think it's 53, there's no cost. And if you're under $83,000, the cost is really marginal. And for anyone with a family with some income deficiencies or challenges right now, and modest income, much of that would be cost a couple $100, or basically, support. The supports from each of those institutions would write that off. So, for the vast majority, if not everybody here in the community around Parliament Street, around Regent Park and Courttown, most of those families, working in modest income families and lower income families, and anyone on social assistance, ODSP, or anything like that, is going to be able to get their first university or college degree without any charge. Yeah. So you need your first undergraduate degree, you want to go to George Brown. And it's interesting, the biggest change, Kevin, I've seen is when I just say, well, for you, there's no charge. Mm-hmm. That changes the conversation. Like, it just is so clear. That's not for anyone. And people in my income bracket, or most of us who are working in the upper middle class, who have incomes above that, will still get the 30% off, so it's more affordable. But it's just clearly no charge. And then there's all kinds of assistance and other programs to help families with the other costs of post-secondary education. And I see it breaking that wall for the first time, where people are starting to see getting a college or university degree, maybe the first in their family, no longer as something that's trespass anymore.
Yeah. I imagine the challenge will then become not the cost, but getting youth from the age of 5 to the age of 18 to the point where they're ready to go to university or college, and that's where a lot of the social supports will be really critical.
And that's why I think, people, I don't live in Regent Park. I live a few blocks away. Mm-hmm. I'm on the edge of this, but this community has been so transformational. Like, I don't think people, when you actually look at the influence that the people here, not by lobbying government, but by just doing these things, have created and been very influential in 12 years of government policy. In the housing, if you look at the West Don Lands right now, post-Pan Am Games, one of my friends said, this is like looking, you go down Mill Street, this looks a lot like Regent Park. All the affordable housing, the TC, a new YMCA, a new pool, George Brown has a facility there, Ashinabi Health going in there, a new community health center, much like Regent Park Health, it's urban. Like that is probably I mean, if you want to see the influence of Regent Park, go and look at the new development right now in the West Don Lands and how much the housing mix, the affordability, the services that are there, the cultural facilities that are going in there, like with Soul Pepper right next door. This idea of integrated neighborhood building, this idea of education policy through schools and support, this idea of changing everything in a way in which the community wants it to change, and keeping everything that is possible that the community wants to keep, is now becoming an idea and a concept and a framework that is driving how new neighborhoods are emerging in the downtown area of Toronto, and how government policy is working. And I think people in Regent Park deserve great credit and should feel an enormous sense of pride. And it's no loss, I think, on people that, the Premier and Minister Koto chose Regent Park to have their, region-wide discussion on racial issues and Black Lives Matter and the other issues related to policing. This community is now regarded as, Toronto's town hall community. It's the great urban lab, the great place where people aren't afraid to try new things.
While we are on that subject and on the subject of people living in at-risk neighborhoods, low-income communities, your government is also sticking a toe in the water of the whole basic income debate. So where is that at the moment? I know I've been getting some updates, but where are we?
I'm excited. I mean, I said this past year has been the year of sort of a very entrepreneurial approach to the environment with the climate change bill, which was recognized, I think, as one of the most progressive, comprehensive of carbon pricing, the Circular Zero Waste Economy Act, Great Lakes Protection. We just had some of the biggest environmental legislation passed, and so I've said to everyone, enough right now. We've got a lot of work to implement that. And someone said to me, well, what do you think what is the big thing on the government's agenda in the next 2 years? What would be the climate change issue? And, it's interesting as you see, Minister Matthews now with a whole new post-secondary strategy coming out of this digital, and Chris Ballard in charge of housing. You have a housing minister and a poverty reduction minister, and Minister Jakes in social services. Looking at this idea of how does a guaranteed minimum income work, and could you build it up? And you've had people like across the political spectrum, conservatives like Hugh Siegel, who's now at Massey College, and many people who have, Art Eggleton, people across the political spectrum have said there might be a better way to do this. And no one's ever, we couldn't find anyone in Canada, not many people in the United States, at least not in a couple of generations, that have ever actually seriously put together the idea of how this could work. Yeah. So the government is now working right now with communities in consultation to look at things like Regent town housing that's more mobile under the housing dollar. So that's one area in which that's happening. But the other one is rent geared to income. And the other area is how much money do you keep? Because, I talk to working women who have who are not working or on ODSP or on some form of social assistance. They have a couple of kids. The kind of income they'd have to get to be able to support their families at the same standard there are, and this is by no means saying that people who are on ODSP, have a very comfortable life. That is a very financially constrained life. It's a very difficult life. Managing life in poverty on social assistance is a full-time job. It is difficult and it is a hard life. And so to move off it, one would be quite motivated to. But if you don't have any social service benefits, if you lose dental benefits, if you lose all of those kinds of things, and you're making $12 or $13 or $14 an hour, you don't have the same financial capacity that you have. And it's not because our social assistance programs are too generous by any means. They're because the value of labor, in my own view, and I'm speaking just personally here, and the value we put on work, and the lack of social infrastructure around people to get that first job. So that other area about how much income do you keep if you are doing part-time work. I was talking to a gentleman today who works 3 days a week, but can only keep the money from one of the 3 days he works. So he works 2 days for free to basically keep a salary for 1 day because it gets taken away on social assistance. So one of the things that is being, I think one of the conversations going on in the community right now, inside and outside of government, is there a way in which that sort of cliff between being on social assistance, benefits, and income can do it. And it's finding expression in that discussion about retained earnings for people who work, so people can actually make that bridge to independence. They can actually find employment and gradually transition until their benefits and their income is as good or better than what they had on social assistance, so that there's real net value to the community. The kids are better fed, the family has more choices, they can raise their standard of living. And the other piece of it is can we look at a minimum? Could that work? And what would be the pathway from where we are to get there? And I think there's going to be some pilot projects and some experiments with that. And that innovation is what everyone's been afraid to do. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You know, under a generation ago, when we were cutting social assistance rates by 20%, and there was a war on the poor, and there was not a lot of public room to stand up and say to the government, people on social assistance, people who are struggling in life are struggling and deserve respect, and maybe enabling them more and supporting people more and respecting them more is the pathway to a healthier, better life, and getting people out of poverty and giving them better choices. This is, to me, a cultural shift that I hope sticks around, because there will be a backlash against this kind of thinking, to go back to that way of make social assistance so unlivable that people have no choice but to get off it. And most people who are on it aren't on it by choice, and that's the big debate, right? You and I think most people, including Hugh Siegel and a whole bunch of other folks, believe that people are not on this by choice. They're on it most often by circumstance, and anyone who's experienced that. So how do you give people better choices? And that's the big pathway to poverty. So I'm hoping this innovation gets us there, and I think that's going to be the big discussion in the next 12 months in government in Ontario, and I'm relieved about that. It's long overdue.
I would agree. I think it's Hugh Siegel talks about our Victorian attitudes towards the poor. We still think, we still live in the world of Charles Dickens, and it's your fault if you're poor. And of course, for years, I've known that for a single mom with a couple of kids to go back to work would be ridiculous. She would lose so much.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what kind of society does that? I think a job should be more than a paycheck. It should be a way to get some dignity and feel good about yourself, and so we've discouraged it for far too long. But I'm preaching to the choir, I realize.
But it's also the political dynamic in Ontario.
Yeah.
And one of the things I find, having grown up in Quebec, lived in Ontario, moved to Manitoba, been in politics there at the municipal level, come back to Ontario.
So basically, you couldn't hold a job. Is that
I couldn't. I got driven out of every town I've been in,
Yeah.
and maybe rightly so. We'll find out in the next election.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because the Ontario election, and I think this is true in Canada, is that there are stable votes. There's certain seats that are Liberal NDP fights. There are other ones that are there's some actually in Southwestern Ontario. There's some NDP Conservative fights now, but it's not 107 seats that is realistically up for grabs unless there's one of those, and they happen, extraordinarily redivides of the political map. But they happen every couple of generations, and we can go back to the 42 years of Conservative government, and then the decade or two after, which was no one was predicting elections in the 80s and 90s. But the battle right now is the big battle for who's in government. If you look at the numbers, are in the close races in the 905, right? Like if you look, and a lot of those, not all of them, but a lot of them are Liberal Conservative races, and you'll see them in suburban Ottawa. So so often the political debates take place based on moving votes in swing seats. I mean, this is one of the things that most politicians don't want to talk about in their own loud voices, because and I'm a big believer, and it's one of the reasons I supported Kathleen Wynne in the leadership race in the end, because she talked about One Ontario, and we have to move beyond these divides. But too often during an election, the media and we ourselves as voters get driven by, where are the votes? I have more people who say to me, well, Glenn, I'd love to support you, but I'm going to go work in a seat which is much more competitive than yours, where where my time is going to, that, which makes it hard for sometimes that. And I keep on saying there's no such thing as a safe seat, but it's hard for me to fault someone who says, look, my friend Joe is running in this seat in in Markham or in Burlington or something. I'm going to go and help my friend Eleanor because she's going to have a really tough fight there. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. That's the kind of thing that I think, and that agenda and the politics of a small subset of communities, because governments, every political party does this, they look at those seats that they have to win, where are the competitive fights, and what are the measurements that are going to, what are the issues that are going to vote those kinds of things. And part of what I'm that's why I don't like rural-urban divides, because I think what happens is that those big issues in the very large urban centers in rural Ontario don't get the same level of debate that they should have. And I think there's a lot of issues in urban and rural Ontario that the politicians who have played that urban-rural card have done us a disservice, because what they've ended up doing is marginalizing those issues in both elections for both rural and urban folks. And I think that I'm hoping, and this is one of the things that I'm hoping these new discussions is that one of the things we as a government can do is not be afraid to have these big conversations, whether it's on guaranteed minimum income or whether it's on climate change or putting a price on carbon, which people were terrified of doing, and we now have a price on carbon. And people, conventional wisdom was 5 years ago, if you read the paper, you get unelected if you put a price on carbon. Now we're the Premier's taking on issues that many politicians for decades have been afraid to tackle, and I hope politicians are rewarded in the next election, not in the sense of votes winning, but rewarded in the sense that these issues are positively discussed, and we get away from what our friend Hugh Siegel calls those Victorian attitudes. If we can have an election free of the ignorance and of this Victorian mentality about poverty, that would be a good election if we could have a more sophisticated debate about it. And hopefully these initiatives, many of them coming from the community themselves, may change that discussion once and for all, which would be a good thing beyond the electoral cycle.
We've been talking for a while. We haven't even touched on the environment, and we have the Minister of the Environment in the House, so we should go there maybe for a few minutes. In Ontario, our carbon emissions are down. That's my understanding. You have the numbers, I'm sure, rattling around in your head a lot better than I do. We no longer have a manufacturing economy in Ontario. How much of that is a factor in where our carbon emissions are these days?
Not much.
Not much?
No. Matter of fact, I had this conversation with the Canadian Manufacturing and Exporters Association. I wouldn't say that. I said we have a restructured one. We're making more automobiles than we ever have before. That often shocks people. That we're literally making more cars today, I think, than we have in my lifetime.
Okay.
We're exporting more vehicles. The economy's changing around that. We've had two big announcements recently. The Pacifica electric battery van coming to Windsor, keeping the 4,000 jobs in the Windsor plant, adding 1,200. It's a big deal. And that's Fiat Chrysler. That's the guy, Marcione, who said, don't buy my electric vehicles. I lose money on them. So that's kind of a nice movement. Thank you, Fiat Chrysler. And in Oshawa, right, in the heart of the old, traditional internal combustion engine, we're having 700 engineers working on autonomous vehicles on this next generation of vehicles, and I think that bodes well, because it's you can't do the engineering unless you have some of the production there. Mm-hmm. So all the people in the auto sector said you need the production facility. Toyota's huge operations, they're working with us right now on some exciting things. Honda, huge operations here with some exciting opportunities. Fiat Chrysler's doing well. General Motors is doing well. Ford is doing well. Universal Platform in Oakville. So people say, well, then, why are there so fewer jobs? Well, I've heard it as over 100,000 less jobs in manufacturing. Mm-hmm. And people say, but we're making more cars, right? Mm-hmm. You don't drop out in grade 10 to go work on the GM line in St. Catharines anymore on the engine line. What you do is you go to UOIT out in Durham region, and you do a degree in robotics, and you do a degree in software. And it's those two things. It's the robotics line. So the auto sector here had relatively low productivity. It has a very high productivity. Through the recession, when we had to sort of go in and save a couple of the companies in those partnerships, what's emerged out of the recession is a highly automated, highly software, highly robotics-driven auto sector, where the skill sets you have to do it. And that's the story, it's the story of agriculture. 3 generations ago, my friend Don McCabe was president of the Ontario Federation of Agriculture, says, 1 in 2, 3 generations ago only, 1 in 2 people in Ontario worked in food and agriculture. Mm-hmm. Today, it's 1.2% of the population, a little more than 1 in 100. And that's part of the challenge for farmers, is because everyone says, everyone used to understand farmers. Yeah, well, 1 out of 2 of us was a farmer or quietly related. So agriculture, we produce more food than we ever had before. I mean, food, what 2 people do, it used to take 100 to do. Yeah. So that's the reality of it. And the industrial manufacturing is now going to the high productivity platform. And so you look at the 600,000 or 550,000 to 600,000 jobs in that range. Don't hold me to those numbers. It's something in that area. 2/3 of those jobs are above the median income level. We have about, I think, 10,000 less part-time jobs than we had in the recession, but we have over 550,000 full-time jobs, and most of them. But they're all high-skilled jobs. They're not people who are assembling and making things. They are the people who are financing, designing, engineering, creating, researching, communicating, teaching, managing, assessing. I mean, all of those functions around in the economy. It's the economy, that company has we make things better. We don't make things, we make things better. Yeah. And for the first world economy, like 700, engineering experts on autonomous vehicles now working in a place where people used to assemble cars by hand is pretty emblematic of that shift. It also creates the problems we're talking about, which is why have free undergraduate education for middle and modest income families and lower income families, is because those jobs now that are really being created require those skill sets. Like, I want people in Regent Park, if they want to go into the auto sector, to be able to go to UOIT, do those robotics jobs, do those software, get into the design auto field, because they're not going to be there with a wrench. Those wrench jobs are disappearing, but those skill sets jobs of working in an auto plant on a keyboard are there and are increasing. So that's the shift. I'm working with I was in Sarnia. We often think of that. 35 major operations. Nova Corporation, massive cogen. We're all working. We're trying to decarbonize that, right? So they're doing $250 million investments going on. These things aren't creating a lot of jobs, but they're depolluting the atmosphere, and they're getting rid of carbon, and they're increasing the productivity and the efficiency of those plants. So you're seeing a lot of massive investments in our industrial infrastructure that a generation or two ago would have been massive job creation. Today they're dealing with things like massive automation and massive cleaning up, and we have 158 major carbon dioxide emitting sites. Most of the cap and trade money much of it's coming from that. Even more of it's going back, and those are to protect those jobs, right? Because we'll be able to say to the world, we're not going to have access barriers because we've internalized the price of carbon the same way we closed coal plants in the last decade. Mm-hmm. We don't want to close these facilities. Quite the opposite. These dollars are going to keep them open. And we actually have the advantage of we've decarbonized our electricity system. So they have clean energy when they plug in. Now they're going to get the money to revitalize and modernize their own energy platforms. And that will be a really positive legacy economically and environmentally to our kids.
People of our generation that were in that manufacturing sector that have lost jobs because the plant is closed. Mm-hmm. What do? How do we help them land as softly as possible when they're 50 years old and don't know what they're going to do to get to retirement and how they're going to retire?
Well, retirement's been a big issue, and that's that's really the reskilling of a workforce and improving pensions and security. I don't think that anyone who tells you they've got the quick and easy answer to that is probably not telling you the truth. Mm-hmm. I mean, in the longer term, we had the ORPP, the Ontario Pension Fund, which we worked very hard on. We got elected on. Yeah. And that came out of a discussion with the federal government earlier, before the last election, before this new government, and we tried to see if there was interest that everyone's recognized we have a retirement pension. The young people today and the becoming middle-aged people could not retire even as well as the current generation has, and you just point out the problem with that. So it's very hard today to do something about people like me or others, or maybe even you, who would normally retire in the 5 or 10-year period coming up, very hard runway. But you can do something for people 20, 30 years out. So one of the big breakthroughs in the long term, this is one of the weirdest things, the government has actually started to solve the longer term problem, which we're always accused of short-termism. So for the next generation of people, all the changes the deal that was done with the new federal government basically provides most of the security and benefits that we were trying to do with the ORPP. So we're not proceeding with the ORPP. But the great thing, I think one of the legacies of Kathleen Wynne will be, because this was really very much her singular, everyone shared it, her singular leadership did that. All Canadians are going to get a better pension plan now over the next couple of decades. In the near term, we have programs like that if you get pushed out of a job, we have programs where you can get $28,000 to go back to school. And that money probably means even more now, because if it's your first degree, if you're one of those people who didn't have advanced education and got pushed out of the economy, there are those kinds of programs. But again, one of the biggest challenges, and not the only one by any means, there's just some very brutal economic realities, is it's cultural. People don't know how to access that. You know, I'm always surprised, that's why my constituency staff is so important to me. So one of the big reasons people can't get out of poverty is they don't know how to navigate government. And they don't know that there's a program that if they lost their job and they don't have skills, they could get $28,000. And that's why, I don't want to be a shameless plug. Pardon me? Okay, but one of the most useful things you can do if you're unemployed is not just go to the employment office, but go to your MPP's office. Every MPP has access to and gets bombarded with every single program available, not just if they're provincial, but federally and things like that. And we do live in a country, and it doesn't mean that you can help everyone. Do you know what I mean? We get women in crisis who sometimes come in, don't want to leave their husbands, don't realize that they can go to the front of the list right now to get housing if they're running away. And my staff has to make sure that that's real, because while that commitment's there, it doesn't mean in every part of Ontario you live in you can do that. And in those situations, you don't want women living in dangerous situations. But using your elected official and your elected official office to access a great range of programs that people often don't know about is really, really important. And one thing, if you ask me, one of the things I don't think we do well enough as a government, we don't have a sort of a one-stop shop that people can go to. We're doing a lot with lower carbon lifestyles, and we have $8 billion roughly going out the door in the next 5 years to help people buy an electric vehicle, to improve cycling, to help make it very affordable for people to reduce their home heating costs and retrofit their home, not just to a low carbon technology, but to one that's much less expensive to do that. The big challenge I do is how do I take that massive amount of money and information and get that out to people who have right-on-time lives, who are worrying about kids, deadlines in the day, trying to think about how much they have to get done before they put their head in the pillow, to stop and think about, geez, maybe I should, retrofit my home heating cooling, and the government will provide me with a generous subsidy that will actually make it less expensive to do it than not do it. The communication challenges are enormous to actually make sure that people can easily access these things in a non-bureaucratic kind of way.
I am reminded that we are just about out of time here. We will have to get you back in here because we could talk like this for considerably more time. We played a speech you gave a few weeks back at the Brickworks when there was a public meeting on climate change, and you said a couple of things that struck me. You talked about the Indigenous idea that the things we do pass on for 7 generations. Mm-hmm. And there's a verse in the Bible that says much the same thing, that says the sins of the father are passed on from mm-hmm. generation to generation. But you also said in that discussion that we need to view all lives as sacred. You got 2 minutes. Tell me what that means to you.
Well, right now, our boreal forest is getting 8 degrees warmer in the winter over the next 30 years, and there's severe doubt about the degree to which that forest can survive, and if it doesn't, that puts a big question mark in our future on this planet. So we're in a real crisis, and we're in a crisis over the next couple of decades. And we're there because we didn't think about our grandchildren's grandchildren. That one tenet of Indigenous thinking, and you reflected it's in many religions and philosophies, but Indigenous people lived that. Their first treaty was not with other people, it was with nature. Yeah. The kind of sacred, solemn engagement they have with living beings before they go hunting or take a life is quite remarkable. They see water as sacred. They see each other as sacred. They see the planet as sacred. They see themselves and each other as sacred. I think we've lost a sense of the sacred in our culture, and I think that I've often said that climate change is a cultural crisis. If you actually look at what are the major obstacles for us to do this, do we have the technology? Yeah, we have technology. We have net zero buildings. We have electric cars. We have all the hydrogen. We have all the technologies. You could deploy it. We could very quickly become a net zero. We could solve this problem. It's not a technology problem. It's very hard when you look at the cultural wars going on around the world, especially the United States right now. You look at our values. You look at how we see our children. You look at how we've extinguished nature from our lives, not just see it as sacred. You look at the fact that politicians make decisions in 4-year electoral cycles, and business people make their investments not on the sustainability of their business and whether it can operate as a non-polluting and what the net benefit is. Triple bottom line, it's shareholder value in the next quarter. So the short-termism and this cultural crisis of values is causing us, it makes it very difficult to to create the leadership and values. And then we get into denial, right? When we extinguish things, when we externalize that, and we remove ourselves from nature, we're not aware of it. People, if they knew the state of our oceans, we've lost half our fish. The oceans absorb most carbon dioxide. Our boreal forest, I think it's estimated, if I have the number right, absorbs 54% of Canada's surface area. It's a global forest. It exists in other countries. It's 12% of the surface area of the planet. But more importantly than all of that, it absorbs, they estimate every year, 26 years of human and industrial greenhouse gas emissions. If the lights go out and if that forest switches from being a carbon sink, absorbing all that carbon dioxide, and it won't go neutral, it'll start to rot, it'll expose methane from the boreal forest floor and starts to emit. That's the worst thing that could possibly happen. Now, I believe the foundation of the fight against climate change is, as my friend Christiana Figueres says, the Secretary General of the United Nations Environmental Program, is unrelenting optimism. The ridiculousness of all of this is we can ride our bikes, we can drive electric cars, we can take public transit, we can buy more local food, we can retrofit our homes to be less expensive to heat and cool. We know how to do all of these things. We're smart people with technology. The problem that is one that we actually have to put greater value on each other and nature, and greater value on our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. And I think there's something to be learned from people who are more connected and see these things and have a sense of sacred, have a sense of the awe-inspiring beauty and how much of it's at risk. There is nothing that human beings have ever wrought or made that comes close to the complexity of a tree's ability to make oxygen, an eagle soaring in the sky, or standing on a mountaintop looking over the beauty of the world. There is nothing as complex in systems as the things we find in nature. There just simply is not. And to lose that out of our own arrogance, out of a sense that none of this is sacred or awe-inspiring, that we don't have a spiritual being, that we don't have souls, that we're something more than a biological eating machine that's measured by how much stuff we consume. We've lost a sense of our soulfulness, the meaning of our lives, I think, in many ways. And it's a bit of a cultural crisis. I mean, the AIDS epidemic stopped me in my tracks and had to ask me, I said, you only got a few decades. You're going to be one of those older people who looks back on their lives of would have, could have, should have. What are you really about? How do you make a difference in this world? What kind of person do you want to be? And I screw up all the time. I mean, I'm a failure more often than I'm a success, but the few successes I've had in life, spiritually and emotionally, have come from rampant failure and eventually learning after hitting myself over the head enough times. I think we have to have the courage to be vulnerable and the sense of inspiration and awe that we can find in this planet and in our spirituality, in our relationship with God, or whatever you conceive of that, to have a sense that we're sacred and this is something special, we're special. And we have this one remarkable little lonely blue planet in a vast vacuum of space, and why or how we're here is worth taking a moment to reflect upon, I think.
That's a great way to end.
Well, thank
we
you,
want to
Kevin.
thank you so much for coming in, and we wish you all the best, obviously, as you deal with the complexity of all of this, and we will talk again.
We will. Thank you for
All
doing
right.
the show.
Thank you.
Thanks to Regent Park and Regent Park Radio for great work you do.